Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fusion 360 Tech Tuesday. My name is Brad Tallis from Autodesk, and today's topic I'm going to be talking about the difference between the old UI and the new UI. And the reason I'm doing this is because I've gotten quite a few comments through my live streams where people are saying, my screen looks different than yours, I don't see this particular command. So I figured it was time for me to step back a little bit and talk about the new user interface. So this is going to be a little bit different because I actually have two versions running on my screen at the same time. So you can see the top one here is the old UI, and the bottom one here is the new shiny, pretty looking UI. So I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth between these and kind of highlight some of the differences. Now, the very first thing you might ask is, how do you get the new UI? Well, to do that, you're going to go underneath your name and then into Preferences. And inside of Preferences, you're going to want to click on this Preview section over here. And you'll see it's organized under General. You'll see this UI Preview. Now in this example it's turned off because this is the old UI, and in this example down here it would be turned on. So I personally recommend turning on the UI preview, and you're going to see why as we go through this live stream. Now before I forget, I want to announce this Thursday at 1 o'clock Mountain we're going to have a live stream, but it's actually going to be my buddy Angelo is going to be doing a cam live stream, so please make sure you attend that. I'm really excited about this one. He's going to go through showing how to create a part and then take it into cam for manufacture. So add that to your calendar. I think Aaron's probably going to link that live stream in the comments, so keep an eye out for that. And I also have my buddy Aaron online to answer all of your questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them out into the chat. So, okay, what's the main difference between the old UI and the new UI? Well, you'll see it right here, kind of where my arrow cursor is we have these tabs now. So we've really simplified the menus and made things just more, it makes more sense. It's a little bit easier to flow. So for example, you'll see here under design, you'll see we have design, generative design, render, animation, simulation, manufacture, and drawings. What you don't see is like patch or sheet metal or anything like that. Like up here, I'm going to go ahead and click on the workspaces, and here you'll see, for example, patch and sheet metal, etc. And there's a lot more of them here. Well, instead, we've brought some of them into this tabbed workspace. So for example, right now I'm in my solid workspace. If I click on this guy, I'll see my surfacing commands. So instead of having to switch to the patch workspace over here, they're right across the top. Same thing with sheet metal. If I click on this little sheet metal tab, I'll see my sheet metal commands. And then one of the other kind of major changes is this tools area. So for example, up here you see we have, in the old UI, we had the make icon, we've had the add-ins, etc. But here they're now organized under the Tools tab. So here's your 3D print, your Proto Labs, etc. We also have our add-ins, for example, our App Store or your scripts and add-ins. And then we also have utilities such as managing your materials or forcing a compute all, for example. And then you'll see all of your inspection commands such as measure, draft analysis, clash analysis, etc. throughout here. Okay, so this is kind of one of the major changes is this tabbed workspace. And I personally really like it. I find it much easier to use than having to constantly switch into different workspaces. Okay. So the next thing is we've also renamed some of them. Now it's kind of hard for me to show because they're both named the same. But for example, what used to be called cam is now called manufacture, and this makes more sense because you could do water jet, laser, cam, etc. under the manufacture. So you'll see some of the names have changed. And then we also have, for example, in here, generative design. And this is some really cool technology. I'm not going to go into it today, but it basically allows you to generatively design your models. So take a look at that. You can search on YouTube for Fusion 360 generative design, and maybe we'll do a future live stream on that topic. The other thing you'll notice is that I have more icons available to me across this menu. So for example, up here in the old UI, under Create, you can see I only had about 3 icons. And yes, I could add more icons in there if I wanted to. But here, because we've removed some of the unnecessary menus, we have a lot more ability to add extra icons in here. Now you have control over what commands show up here. So for example, you can see I have this sphere command. Now I can come in here, I'm just going to go ahead and drag that off so you can kind of see it went away. And I'll show you how you can add commands into these menus. So to get rid of any of them, you just basically drag off of the menu. So you can kind of see I'm taking this pattern and I'm dragging it off of my menu there. You also see this whole command is if I click and drag on it, I can move it around. So I can organize where I want that whole command. So here you can see I've put it at the end. Or if I click and drag it and hold to the left, you'll see I can reposition where I want those commands. Okay. If I want to add a custom command to my menu, or I should say a command to my menu, I'm just going to come under here, like for example, under the sphere, and you'll see these 3 little dots. Now if I click on those 3 little dots, I get some options here. Pin to toolbar, pin to shortcuts, and change keyboard shortcut. And I'm actually going to talk about this one a little bit later, but I'm going to say pin to toolbar, and you'll see that it put it up into my toolbar. So if there's any commands that you might use quite a bit, such as, for example, the sweep command, you can come in here and say pin to toolbar, and it's going to add that command to your toolbar. The other one in there is, let me go ahead and let's just do like a cylinder. You'll see it says pin to shortcuts. Now I want to highlight what that means. So if I'm just out here in my screen, if I hit the S key on my keyboard, this brings up my shortcuts menu. And this is a very handy tool that I don't really show all that often, and I probably should show it more. But this S key, S is in shortcut, allows you to add the commands you use quite often. And it also allows you to search for particular commands. So for example, let's say I use the cylinder command quite a bit. So I could come in here and say cylinder, pin to shortcuts. Okay. Now when I hit the S key, you'll see there's that cylinder command in my shortcuts. The other thing that I find really handy is you can actually search for commands. So for example, let's say I want to do a reflect. So I'm going to start typing in reflect, and you'll notice that nothing comes up. And so I know that there isn't a reflect command in Fusion. So maybe it's called mirror. So I'm going to type in mirror, and sure enough, you can see all of the commands that have MI in them because I just typed in MI. So there's the mirror command. And all I have to do is hit this little up arrow, and it says add to shortcuts. And I've now added that command to my shortcuts. So a couple different ways of doing that. And what's neat about this is that works anywhere. I could be, I could zoom up on this, for example, hit my S key, and there are those commands that I use quite often. So instead of having to come up to the menu, hit create, and then mirror, I can just get to it very, very quickly with my shortcut key, my S key. And like I said, pretty much anything you can search for example, trim, I'll start typing in trim. There you can see there's the trim command. Okay, maybe appearance. So I'm going to start typing in appearance, and there's the appearance command, and I could add that to my design shortcuts. And next time I hit the S key, there's my appearance command. So as you get more proficient with the product, I personally recommend using shortcut keys like L for line or design methods. So let's say you're doing a lot of extrusions. You might want to put the extrude command in there, but maybe the other person does a lot of trimming and surfacing. They might want to put some of the surfacing commands in there. So definitely use that to your advantage. Okay. So, like I mentioned, you can have commands across the top here. And we've also organized it to make a little bit more sense in, like, for example, this menu here. And again, it looks kind of weird because I have my screen split. But basically, you can see under the Create menu, you can create components, you can create sketches, you can create forms, you could create a derive, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it basically allows you to start with a particular component and kind of derive a different one off of that, which is kind of cool. You could create extrudes, revolves, sweeps, etc. You could create your, your solids like your boxes, cylinders, spheres, etc. You can create patterns and mirrors. So you can see that pretty much all of these commands have to do with the create. And then we have modify. And you'll notice the modify menu is going to be a little bit shorter. But basically, once you've created something, you can then modify it by using, for example, press pull, or adding fillets or chamfers, shelling the part out, maybe moving the part around, modifying its physical material or its appearance. You could modify what the shape of it looks like, with parameters, which we've talked about previously. Okay. So for example, I'm going to go back to the old UI, and you can see the modify menu here. You can see the create menu here also. Okay. Okay. One of the other things I like with the new UI is if you have a whole bunch of designs open. So I'm going to go ahead and click this little plus symbol, and you'll see it created a new design. I'm going to do this multiple times. So you're going to see it's going to add a whole bunch of these designs across the top here. Well, what if I have a whole bunch of them? Like, let's say maybe like 15 of them or so. You can see I now get this little pull down. So instead of making these little tiny little tabs or whatever, it puts as many as it can per my screen size. But now I have this little pull down, and I can pick any of these designs. So for example, the very first one, and it's going to take me to my very first design. So that's another cool little trick not a lot of people know about. I typically don't have that many across, but maybe if I was working on a complicated project or something like that, I might actually have this many tabs open. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close these out because I don't really need them. Okay, let's just leave a couple up. That's fine. Okay, the next really big change, I think, and probably my favorite, is when you actually create a sketch. So I'm going to do this in the new UI. So I'm going to say create sketch. And you're going to see it's going to allow me to pick which plane I want to sketch on. So I'm just going to click on this front face. You're going to see this new command right here, this new tab, and it's kind of highlighted in blue. You also see that Finish Sketch is highlighted in blue. So this is a very visual way of letting me know that I'm in the sketch menu. previously, for example, if I said create sketch, I'll do the same thing. You really didn't know that you were in the sketch menu except for this icon up here, for example. And this got a little bit confusing to some people. They were like, why am I not seeing stuff in 3D, etc., etc. So we made it so you can definitely tell that you're in this like sketch environment. Okay. And now the other thing I think is really neat is, for example, I could switch to my solid tab and see, all my solid commands or whatever, but you can see that that sketch is still highlighted. So I know that I'm actually actively working on a sketch. So I can click back here and I'm back into my little sketch environment. So that I think is huge. The fact that it's more visible to see that I'm in my sketch really helps me out personally. Okay. We've also simplified the sketch environment. So for example, you'll notice now, instead of one huge menu under Create, we've actually kind of organized it to make more sense. So we now have a Create and we have a Modify sketch. So up here, you'll see, I'm going back to the old UI. Here's my sketch commands. Okay, and then there's all these little pull downs, etc. And then there was all the modify commands and then the dimension command, etc. Whereas in the new UI, you just basically have your create. I want to create lines, rectangles. I want to create patterns. I want to create a dimension. And then all of the modifiers are over here in the modify menu. So here's where you could add fillets, or you could trim or move stuff or offset stuff. Okay. Again, kind of making things a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to manage. The next thing is the constraints are now across the top here. Previously, let me jump to the old UI. You'll notice how long the sketch palette is. I mean, it was crazy long. And if you didn't have a big enough screen or whatever, sometimes you'd have to scroll down to get to the, the constraints that you might typically use. So with the new UI, we simplified the sketch palette. Notice much smaller, and the constraints are now up here in the menu. At first, I was like, well, I kind of liked them in the sketch palette. They were right there. But I'll show you some neat tips. This is actually really easy to use. But you can also, check this out. I'm going to go ahead and maybe just draw a couple shapes here real quick. Maybe just a couple circles. And then I'm going to pre-select those two circles. And notice what happened to my constraints. It actually grays out the ones that don't make sense, the ones that you can't really use with what I've pre-selected. And so I've pre-selected two circles, and so it's saying I could do the tangent constraint, I could do the equal constraint, I could do the concentric constraint, for example, and you'll see how it's grayed out like parallel, perpendicular, midpoint, etc. Okay? So again, just by pre-selecting, it'll highlight which ones that work. And just like before, I could come in and say, you know what, I use concentric quite a bit, so I'm going to pin that to my toolbar. And I've just added the concentric constraint up there. Maybe I use the midpoint is already up there. Perpendicular is already up there, fix is already up there, so you see a majority of them are up there. I'll do the equal constraint. Let's go ahead and pin that to the toolbar. So you can display as many or as few as you want. And again, sometimes I might not ever use the fix constraint or something like that, so I could remove that off of my menu and just use the display the ones that I use more often. Okay. Another thing you can do is if I select these two circles, I can right mouse click and it shows me the ones that make sense. And I actually use this more than anything. Instead of coming up to the menu, I just right click and it gives me a bunch of different options here. So again, I could make them concentric, I could fix them in place, I could make them tangent, or I could make them equal. So it shows me the ones that make sense. So for example, let's go ahead and add a line on here, just some weird angle. I'll go ahead and select those two, right mouse click, and it shows me the only ones that make sense with a line and a circle is to fix them or to make them tangent. So really cool commands at your right mouse click menu. I'll just do another line here. Oops. I'll go ahead and get rid of that guy. Don't need him. So I'll pre-select these two lines, right mouse click, and it shows me all of the options. So this is what I use a lot. Okay. You also see really easily I could, for example, change those to construction, right? Just by clicking on them, right mouse click, I could say normal or construction instead of having to come over to the sketch palette to do that. So that's one of the major changes is the sketch palette has been simplified. There's some new additions that I haven't really highlighted here. Let me go ahead and just throw a couple dimensions on here real quick. Like so. Let's just dimension this guy, and then I'll leave that other one blank. So one of the options in the sketch palette you can see here is show dimensions. So you can actually toggle this on or off. So if your sketch gets kind of complicated, gets kind of lots of stuff on it, like dimensions, etc., you can turn off show dimensions. Same thing with if you have a lot of constraints on there. I don't have hardly any. So let's just go ahead and do, for example, a perpendicular. I'll just do these guys so we can see those perpendicular constraints. I could turn those on or off. So a neat little option there. And I think we just added this show projected geometries toggle in one of the latest updates. So for example, let me go ahead and create an offset plane like so. Okay, I'll go ahead and create a sketch on that plane, and I want to project this end. So I'm going to come under create, project, and I'll just go ahead and project that like so and say okay. And if I toggle this show projected geometries on or off, you can still see it kind of shows that profile, but it's turning off all those little dots that show, hey, this is linked to this particular object here. So that's another neat new little enhancement right there. Okay. Let me see. Oh yeah, so another thing, and I've kind of shown this already, when I right mouse click, I get my menu up here, which it's called a marking menu. So you can kind of see, for example, if I go to 12 o'clock, it'll repeat the last command. I've got press pull, I've got the whole command. But down here you'll see some commands, and this has been simplified. And I'll show you the old UI and I'll show you this new one. So notice you'll see in here, for example, the line, rectangles, circles, splines, commands that you might use quite often. Okay. In the old UI, when I right mouse clicked, it was just basically every single command. So I have to fly out and click on shell or whatever. So there was just a lot going on in here that people didn't use very often. So with this new user interface, you'll see, the commands that you use much more often, such as panning, zooming, line commands, rectangle commands, etc. So we've simplified the right mouse click quite a bit. Okay, I see a lot of questions and comments going into the chat, so thank you, Aaron, for answering all of those. One of the last things I really want to talk about is the custom keyboard shortcuts. Now, I mentioned the S key And I'm gonna make my screen bigger now since I'm kind of done talking about the old UI. So I'm still in my sketch menu right now. I know that because I can see it's blue and blue right there. So I'm gonna say finish sketch, and I'm back into kind of my 3D representation now. If I go ahead and edit that sketch, again, very visible visual confirmation that I'm in my sketch menu. Okay, so I talked about the S key, where if I hit S, it brings up my shortcuts. Now notice what's going on here. I'm in my sketch environment, and so I see my sketch type commands. Okay, if I were just out here and I hit my S key, I see my design shortcuts. So I don't see my sketch shortcuts, I see my design shortcuts. If I were in drawings, you would see drawing shortcuts. So these shortcuts exist for any of the environments that you're in, such as your regular modeling design, rendering, simulation, CAM, and even drawings, for example, have their own individual little design shortcuts, or I should say shortcuts. Okay, so I personally recommend using the S key. The other thing you can do is to create custom keyboard shortcuts. So you're probably familiar, for example, with like L for line, H for hole, E for extrude. But notice under like revolve and sweep, you'll see like, for example, under revolve, Control Shift R. Well, this isn't a standard command. This is something that I added. Same thing with the sweep command. So check this out. I'm going to go ahead and let's just use the revolve command. So I'm going to say change keyboard shortcut. And you'll get this little menu that pops up, and it allows you to assign a new shortcut key for revolve. So I'm just going to hit R on my keyboard. And notice it says, hey, that conflicts with an existing command called 2-point rectangle. So I can't use just R. Well, R makes sense for revolve, so maybe I'll do like Control R, and now notice I didn't get an error message that time. So I know that I could use Control R. Let's try Alt R, and it says, okay, that one's reserved, so I can't use that one. Okay, so just keep an eye out right here if it'll tell you whether or not you can use that. So I can't use Alt R, but I can use Control R. Or I could try Shift R, and sure enough, that works. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to use Control R and say, okay. And now if I come back into my Create menu, we'll see that Control R works for revolve. So again, as you start to get more proficient with the product, you could assign custom commands. So for example, for rectangular pattern or whatever, you could come in here and say change keyboard shortcut, and maybe for this one I'm going to use a Shift P, for example, for pattern. Or let's just try P, and unfortunately that conflicts with project, so I'm going to say Shift P in this case. And now I'm out here in space somewhere, I hit Shift P, and you'll notice it brings up my rectangular pattern. So again, I usually don't, when I'm going through my live streams, I try and teach to the bell curve. And what that means is I know that there's some beginners, I know that there's some advanced people, and there's a bunch of people right in between. And so I try and teach to everybody. So I sometimes don't use these shortcut keys as often as I would normally, on my own designs or whatever. But as you're going through, as you're getting stronger with the product, definitely use some of those shortcut keys, the S key, etc. And I highly recommend trying out the new user interface. It'll probably take you 15-20 minutes to kind of get used to it, and you're like, why didn't I switch earlier? So with that, I'm going to keep this one a little bit short. Definitely make sure you attend this Thursday's live stream, 1 o'clock Mountain, for Angelo's CAM live stream. I'm really excited about these. we've brought him on board. We actually stole him from Tesla, so very knowledgeable in CAM. And he's going to start taking designs and showing how would you actually manufacture these? How would you do your setups, tools, etc.? What kind of tool paths should you use? So definitely sign up for those, and I hope to see you on a future live stream. Thank you.